Hello and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. And today I'm really pleased to be speaking with Michelle. Michelle, hey, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I am really excited for our chat over the next wee while. And just to give a little bit of background to our listeners and viewers, Michelle is an innovation strategist, and she's all about creating and enabling environments to accelerate impact. She's really focused on human-centered design, and she's an expert in working with pyramid end users. So Michelle, I'd love for you to unpack that for us, but just to kind of as a starting point, can you let us know what's your journey been to date, and how has human-centered design become the thing that you've become so focused on?
Sure. So I started my career actually in humanitarian relief. I worked with the Red Cross for 7 years. Primarily in Iraq and Afghanistan, actually. And as you can imagine, in those operating environments, problem solving is pretty essential.
Right.
Oftentimes problem solving in those environments is incredibly time-bound and fast-paced, and you really have to get creative with your solutions. A lot of the types of resources and solutions that you might have access to in a different environment are just not available in a war zone. And so I really enjoyed my time with that work. But what I started feeling towards the end of it was really that the humanitarian relief, which is really all about kind of real-time solutions and solving real-time problems, doesn't have long-term effect on the communities and populations that are suffering from that conflict. And so I became more interested in making a transition to international development, where the focus is much more on long-term problem solving and focusing on infrastructure and policies and strategies for enhancing country development from a long-term perspective. And so I transitioned to a company called Pact about 5 years ago in the fall of 2013. And at the time, Pact was looking to start an innovation initiative. And so at the time when I made that transition, was really focusing a lot on my experience in the field and my experience with problem solving. And we had been using a lot of the tools and techniques which an innovation expert might use in that environment, except we were really focused on humanitarian problems, and we weren't really being called an innovation team. And so with the transition to Pact, it was a chance to kind of relabel and rebrand a lot of the work that I was doing overseas. And then we were pulling a lot of kind of private sector tools and techniques for problem solving into this new innovation practice at Pact. And one of those tools is design thinking or human-centered design or user-centered design. There's a lot of lingo you can use to describe that approach to problem solving. But the real emphasis there is trying to understand user need first and foremost, instead of kind of assigning what you as the designer think the problem is, and then working with those underlying drivers of user decision making to better understand what types of solutions do and do not work in a certain environment. And so to date, I am now the director of innovation at Pact. We have a 6-person global team serving 40 different countries, and design thinking or human-centered design is really one of the things that our team is known for. We've done design exercises in over 12 countries around the world on a variety of different problem statements, from women's economic empowerment to artisanal small mining to health and HIV programming. And so our practice, our human-centered design work, is really focused on that base of the pyramid. So those are people who are living on less than $2.50 a day. They may lack any formal education. And so we're really working with that population to understand what those underlying drivers are of their decision making, where their true need is coming from, to build more empathetic and intuitive solutions to their problems.
Right. And can you give me an example of a time, especially with that particular user group, where actually if you hadn't been as focused on the human-centered design element, you could have designed what you thought was a solution that was way off base?
Yeah, that's such a great question. When asked a question like that, I tend to refer to a design thinking exercise we did in Colombia in 2016. And it was a really a kind of high profile design thinking exercise for our company. We were doing a pre-position for a $65 million US government proposal that was going to come out in about 4 months. And so to focus the pre-position, we had 3 objectives that we knew the US government was going to focus on. So we decided to use the design thinking exercise to focus on the second objective, which was around economic empowerment opportunities for Afro-Colombian and Indigenous women. The whole proposal was about the social inclusion of Afro-Colombian and Indigenous people. And so that second objective around economic empowerment, we put together a design team that was made up of both innovation staff as well as our local Colombian staff. And we did a design thinking exercise in a few different villages in Northeast Colombia. Some of them were Indigenous, some of them were Afro-Colombian. And we were kind of there operating under the premise that we needed to provide economic empowerment opportunities for these women because that was what the objective of the proposal wanted. But after spending, hours and days in the communities with these women, we began triangulating a really important insight in our ethnographic research, in our need finding. And nobody is coming up and telling you this insight. This is why human-centered design is powerful. It's something that has to be triangulated with multiple methods of data collection, from interviews to focus group discussions, to observation, to even nonverbal activities, which are kind of creative activities done so that people don't have to speak during them. You're just kind of asking them to participate in like a little game or activity where you can watch what the outcome is. And for us, by the end of our need finding, it had become really clear that even though intellectually the women expressed to us that they wanted more economic empowerment and they wanted greater income and they wanted livelihoods, opportunities to provide for themselves, ultimately, these communities, these women had been so traumatized by the conflict, the guerrilla conflict with FARC and ELN, which are the 2 predominant guerrilla groups in the Colombian conflict, that these women did not actually want economic empowerment opportunities to be successful, because that would have meant bringing the guerrilla groups inadvertently back into their communities to start demanding the profits from these economic empowerment opportunities. And the women perceived economic empowerment is too vulnerable for them, and should their activities be successful, they were going to potentially destabilize the safety of their village. And so that was very powerful for us because PACT is well known for its micro-enterprise economic empowerment activities. Micro-enterprise meaning women who are participating in their own small enterprise. They're selling vegetables or they're selling handicrafts. And we realized that the perception of vulnerability around micro-enterprise for women was going to be way too powerful. They perceived it as being vulnerable and unprotected, and no one was going to intervene if the guerrilla groups came back into the village and started demanding the profits that they were making. And so with that insight, we had to make a massive pivot in how we were going to address creating solutions for economic empowerment, which is an objective of this huge proposal.
Right.
While knowing that the community views these activities as unsafe.
Yeah.
It was very powerful for us.
So I am fascinated to unpick 2 elements of that, because that's such a powerful story. And I wondered if you could speak to 2 parts. One, what part does ego play when we might hear something from a human-centered design activity that we maybe don't want to hear because, hey, this is the problem I was setting out to solve? Or what about if, well, maybe not from an ego perspective, but what if it does not contribute to the aims and the goals of my business or my organization?
Yeah, great questions. And definitely the latter question PACT was really asking when we came back from that first trip, what did we pay you guys for? You came back and told us that we can't address the proposal. Right. So To the first question about ego, one of the beautiful things about human-centered design or design thinking is that it constantly forces the designers to check their assumptions. And this is a very kind of openly acknowledged aspect of the design thinking approach, that at every phase of the process, you as the designer should be checking assumptions. And there's a really powerful piece of the process where after you do all that need finding, that data gathering, you actually should sit down and redefine your problem statement. And so if your original problem statement is really not supported by a lot of the data that you gathered through that ethnographic research, you should redefine your problem statement, which for a lot of people kind of puts you back at square one. But that is actually why you use human-centered design. It's an extremely iterative circular process, because what you're trying to do is stay authentic to the need of the end user. And so you just can't keep powering through with a problem statement that you think is accurate if your end user just gave you a ton of data indicating that's really not what the problem is. And so for us, it was an extremely, and this is segueing into your second question, it was a really challenging design process to navigate, because we kind of beheld ourselves to designing for this USG $65 million proposal, and then just unearthed an enormous amount of data that indicated that the solutions that we had in mind, again, checking assumptions, were really just not going to fly with that community. And so what we had to do was, once you've done that data gathering phase, you move into an intentional ideation phase within human-centered design. And it was during the ideation phase that we decided to put pretty clear constraints on our brainstorming, so that we would still brainstorm for economic empowerment solutions, but they had to be solutions that were not going to make the women feel vulnerable. And so one of the things that we really heavily focused on was trying to link economic empowerment to SENA activities. Now, SENA is the government entity in Colombia responsible for vocational training, for skills training, for job placement. And what we were hearing from the women was that SENA only had brick and mortar locations. And because most of these villages were up in the mountains and really inaccessible, they didn't have access to SENA services because there were no brick and mortar locations. And so one of the most creative solutions that we felt we came up with was actually coming up with this concept of pop-up SENA clinics, where we would, put together a van, and we would partner with SENA, and we would drive village to village and literally pop up a SENA office out of the van and run trainings for a couple of days, in the town center or at a church at a location that's really accessible to a lot of the community, and then close off those services, drive on to the next village. And so it gave the perception of authority and government and protection by participating in those pop-up SENA clinics, while also giving the women more vocational trainings, and also to the benefit of SENA, connecting them to this marginalized population that previously did not have access to their services. So that was one of the kind of top 3 ideas that came out of our brainstorm.
Right, and that's a great example of framing how without that you wouldn't have known that this kind of legitimizing of the project was super needed.
Yes.
So for someone who is starting out and they're hearing what you're saying, they're maybe a product designer or product owner in an early stage startup, where could they kind of take a starter for 10 for looking into more about human-centered design?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're a startup and if you're an entrepreneur and you're not already doing human-centered design, I would so strongly encourage you to become well-versed in this approach, because what I've often seen is that entrepreneurs who wonderfully are so passionately excited about their idea that they look for validation of their concept and not for authentic user understanding, because entrepreneurs are in love with their solution, which is fantastic because it takes a lot of energy to be an entrepreneur and you really end up climbing a lot of uphill battles. And so without diminishing that passion for your solution, I think it's really important for an entrepreneur to have a lot of self-awareness and to check themselves when they realize that they're looking for validation of their concept, and instead of really authentically listening to their end user and being willing to really love the problem more than love their solution. And so there are free resources available online. You can look at Acumen resources or IDEO resources. At PACT, we use a revised version of Stanford's D-Lab design thinking process. Their process is a 5-step process. It's available online if you want to look into that. And it's the process that we have really kind of adopted at PACT, except that at PACT, our process focuses specifically on that really poor and marginalized end user, who design thinking is a somewhat Western-based approach to problem solving. And so we really tailored and adopted that approach to use it with base of the pyramid communities who are not used to being asked to do blue sky thinking.
Right.
And so our brand, our flavor of design thinking really focuses on that community. But those Acumen, those IDEO, and those Stanford opportunities are really useful for learning the process. And then I would really encourage entrepreneurs to go one step further. You've got to practice it. Human-centered design is an extremely practical methodology. It's definitely not one of those things that you can just take a course in the classroom and then be good to go. You have to do it over and over again, because it can be really uncomfortable when you encounter data and information that is seemingly throwing you way off the process you thought you were going to take.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much power to your storytelling there, and we will definitely share those resources on our Slack community. And I appreciate it. I think any opportunity for founders, builders, makers to check our assumptions is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for your time. And I wanted to say, especially dialing in from the US, we appreciate that. So huge thanks there to Michelle. That was Michelle Reisinger, who's an innovation strategist, and you can definitely read up more about her work at PACT and human-centered design. So again, thank you so much, Michelle. It was great having you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Lizzie.
Bye.